Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. A little concern there. Very sorry that I missed yesterday. I was very interested in yesterday, but I couldn't arrive until last night. But I heard that you had a very interesting and exciting debate, so I hope that continues today. I had a couple of mistakes in the introduction. I no longer work for DNV, so I work for a small organisation called Riskren. I am Scottish. I live in Singapore, and I travel almost constantly, so I'm not entirely sure where I'm from anymore. The subject of my talk is risk management standards. I'm going to talk a little bit about risk, and I'm going to talk about oversight. I have worked in this field now for about 12 years. A lot of my work has been around inspections and audits, trying to develop safety and security management systems for facilities, trying to do the types of risk assessment that you would often see in other major hazard industries. So I come to it with a slightly different perspective than maybe some of the traditional biosafety and biosecurity people. I have worked in many areas which I think are extremely interesting, including eradicated pathogens. And one of my areas of interest is how as society do we view this, what we would describe as high-risk work. How should it be controlled? How should we have oversight, etc.? And at the moment, the field is largely guideline-driven in many countries, and there are some moves towards standardization, so I want to touch on some of these issues. Unfortunately, I don't know how the pointer works. Okay. So the objectives, some current practices and alternative mechanisms, look at what traditionally has been done, what is beginning to emerge in terms of control philosophies, some of the challenges in providing oversight, and there are very, very real challenges in providing oversight, some areas that I think should be focus areas, and some conclusions. I will qualify what I'm going to say. My job is not usually to decide whether or not this work should go ahead. My job is usually, if it is to go ahead, can it be done reasonably safely and reasonably securely? So that discussion, I'm sure, is going to take place with other people. The presentation is to stimulate discussion. I think a good argument is very healthy. So hopefully I will say one or two things that people may disagree with. And the views are very much my own. They do not represent the views of any of the people that I work with. Riskren, we are based in Singapore. We work in three areas: laboratory, biorisk management. In recent years, I was dragged kicking and screaming into hospital-acquired infections, so infection control and healthcare, which of course at the moment is very interesting because they have discovered Ebola. And one of the things I was thinking about on the plane over, what is risk and what is safety? We're talking about things like influenza. Last 2 weeks I've been working with hospitals that struggle to get 5% vaccination in their healthcare staff. So if you want to talk about dangerous industries, infection control and healthcare is one of the very dangerous industries. But I think this conference is very useful and very interesting because we're actually talking about some of the things that have very large potential for risk in terms of safety and security. But there are many other industries that handle biologicals. Often the controls in these industries are way less than what we would see in laboratory environments, but they have massive impact on society on almost an annual basis. I've worked some work in biosecurity, including some involvement for a few years. I was an honorary Norwegian attending the Biological Weapons Convention meetings. And I know that Ray is going to talk about the BWC, so I will touch on that also. Different containment levels. I'm not a fan of containment levels, 1 to 4, and I will say a few words about containment levels. Animal laboratories, which are often some of the higher risk laboratories given the nature of the work. Pharma and vaccines, and a number of different programs, both in developed economy situations, but also, if you want to look at dangerous labs, go to rural Vietnam and go to the TB labs where they have extensively drug-resistant TB and the facilities are almost non-existent. Work with many organizations. WHO did the smallpox inspections last 2 times with WHO. Been involved in polio eradication from the beginning, really. Some work with the European Commission, people like ASM. We have done some work with Rotterdam. So a very good group at Rotterdam, and we have been involved in some of the work that's been done there, some of the risk assessment work, and basically various places around the world. So what is the traditional approach to biosafety and biosecurity? So based around 2 things, really, risk groups and containment levels. So risk groups describe the pathogen in a fairly high-level way and attempt to assign it to some kind of a risk group. Based on a variety of different criteria, pathogenicity, risk of spreading, availability of prophylaxis, etc. And there are examples of relatively harmless, in inverted commas, organisms, right up to some of the ones which are considered to be some of the most dangerous. That's then combined with what we describe as containment levels. Whoever developed the model, I wish they had made 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the other one A, B, C, D. But we have 1 to 4 for risk groups, 1 to 4 for containment levels. And it goes from a basic laboratory at level 1, which is pretty much a room, to something a little more complicated at level 2, to something which can be extremely complicated at level 3, to something which, again, in my opinion, is pretty simple at level 4. So level 4 is fairly well described. It's fairly well defined. Where you have problems often is when you want to do major hazard work at BSL 3, because that is a vast array of different types of laboratories and different types of work. So BSL 1's okay. BSL 2 can be a bit dodgy. BSL 3 can be very, very complex. And again, BSL 4 is relatively straightforward. So those were the models, I think, which were developed some decades ago, which people still use. It's really the basis for controls in most countries and most sectors. But there are some issues. It should be based on a risk assessment. So the organism should be allocated based on a risk assessment. But often, if you ask to see the risk assessment is not so detailed. Sometimes the risk assessment is not actually documented. So one of the issues is in this sector, we talk all the time about risk assessment, but what does a risk assessment actually mean? What does a risk assessment actually look like? What methodologies should we use? What criteria should we use, etc.? It's not always clear. Driven by a number of factors, including the characteristics and the nature of the activities. In reality, these are loosely defined and require significant interpretation. Okay, so even if you look at the simple side, which is the facility, it requires a huge amount of interpretation. That interpretation becomes more complicated when you start to use someone else's guidelines. So if you start to use the BMBL in Europe, or heaven forbid when we use it in Asia, it's based upon a huge raft of different things, including lots of government agencies, lots of other regulations which are in place and in use in the US. So it's not really so simple. GMOs have additional controls, so it's quite common in different countries. When you go there, you see the normal wild-type biosafety regulations, and they're this thick, and then you see the GMOs, and they're this thick. So GMOs tend to be treated differently. In reality, they should probably be treated the same in terms of a risk assessment and what is a required level of containment. Often they are put into a higher level of containment almost de facto. They're considered to be more risky. If it's a pathogenic organism, it may get a higher level of containment. Interestingly, recently when we were talking about post-polio eradication, looking at the specifications for the laboratories, which are going to be much more stringent than they are today, one of the regulators immediately said, as soon as it's eradicated, it becomes BSL 3. That's not really what the risk groups and containment levels were designed to do, but people now use them as pigeonholes, often, in my opinion, inappropriately. In recent years, 1 to 4 has been supplemented by BSL 3+, BSL 2+, BSL 3++, BSL 4-. Whoever started that, I would like to meet the gentleman because it causes even more problems. Often the pluses, we don't know what the pluses are, how they're defined. Often it's BSL 2 with BSL 3 practices. I have no idea what that means. So again, we use what's already a fairly loose set of descriptors in many cases, and we're supplementing it with additional descriptors, which often don't mean a great deal in my humble opinion. Challenges, controls heavily orientated towards the facility. Okay, so 90% of the energy is often put into the building. What are the systems in the building? It's not always clear that all the building systems are highly relevant for all of the organisms. The vast majority of accidents are caused by unsafe acts. So the example that I use is we're building the latest laptop, and often we're running Windows 95. Okay, so the management system is really what keeps the people safe. One thing that I would like to compliment the organizers on this particular seminar is we have many of the practitioners. Too much biosafety is discussed with biosafety people, and I think it's very good that we have policy people, we have some of the leading scientists who are discussing some of these issues. Controls are often designed to protect people outside the lab. The greatest risk is from people inside. So you can test the ventilation, you can show that it's not going to go into the car park. Do you really know what happens to the ventilation inside the room? Because your biggest risk is probably someone inside the laboratory who is exposed or infected and then walks out and goes back into the community. And you see that in healthcare, and you see the examples that we have at the moment with Ebola. Security controls focus on outsiders as opposed to insiders. Most people, if you have a discussion, whether they would have an open discussion or a discussion in the bar, and you say to them, where is the biggest risk? They would say it's insiders. Outsiders are relatively easy to control. All these controls about vehicles going through the foyer, etc., my opinion, that's highly unlikely. The insiders may also be highly unlikely, but there are controls required for insiders. And if you talk even at the highest levels about things like two-person rules, often you get a great deal of resistance. So if we really want to control insiders, there are procedural areas that we should address, and these are not terribly well described in many of the standards. Industry is moving away from many of these models on the basis of cost. So an example is the recent TB manual, and the TB manual is pretty much giving up on BSL 123, talking about low, medium, and high risk work, which is associated with certain activities. In my opinion, that was the original intent of the BSL 1234. So it's interesting to see some groups now heading back in that direction. Regulations and other control mechanisms often use these as a basis for setting requirements which may or may not be appropriate. I've mentioned one example. Another one would be the focus on the confidence building measures in the Biological Weapons Convention, which focus on BSL-4. Okay, BSL-4 is a very small number of labs which are extremely expensive. If you want to do anything of any scale, you probably wouldn't do them in BSL-4. And that might not be where you would necessarily set all of your focus. But again, it's using containment levels, perhaps out of context. Few international oversight mechanisms, although the work and the funding is increasingly globalized. Many countries just do not have the capacity and the capability to oversee their own programs. We do risk assessments, and we often bring in the regulator. And at the end of the session, the regulator will say, this has been a wonderful training experience because we really now begin to understand what is happening. Okay, so who should oversee this at an international level? How can you make sure that you have competent national regulators in what is a very complex, fast-changing field? Field is very diverse and complex, and I think the simple models really now are struggling to cope. So what is the inverted commas modern approach? Biorisk management. I came up with the word biorisk in 2002 when I worked for DNV, and we actually took out a trademark on the word. And basically the attempt was to say we need to control biological organisms. How would we control them? Looking at the methodologies, etc., that we use in other industries, and bearing in mind that a biological agent is not oil and gas. So the notion was we should develop standards, we should do auditing, we should do risk assessment, etc. And that was where biorisk management came from. I am entirely biased. I was the project manager for the original CWA standard. So you can assume that what I tell you has no impartiality whatsoever in this particular area. But the CWA is a very good document, in my opinion, to assess the types of work that we are talking about in this meeting. Okay? Not necessarily the tool that you would choose for much simpler work, much more standard work, but when you're faced with complex issues and a very high level of assurance is required, this is the type of mechanism that I would recommend people should use. Based around the principles of safety management systems, risk assessment, and the need for auditing and approval. And this document is now available. Some people are using it. I think there is increasing uptake, but it is about to enter an ISO process, which I hope will lead to greater uptake. How does it differ? Based around safety and security management system philosophy, it's a holistic approach. You have to deal with human factors. You have to deal with competency, not just training. You have to deal with all the different types of emergencies. You can raise issues like the need for drug and alcohol policies and testing. So it is much, much wider than the traditional approaches, and what it really says is that safety and security is the responsibility of the chief executive or the director, the PIs, etc., and it spreads responsibility and accountability across the organization. Performance-based, so things must be measured. If you want to know how secure your facility is, tell me, what are your criteria for defining security? What level of control do you want? Once we can determine that level of control, we can measure whether or not you're achieving those measures. Process-orientated, and again, the onus is on the organization to demonstrate that they are managing the risk. It's not the job of the regulator to understand the risk. The risk must be understood and managed by the organization. Oversight is provided by the regulator or others. So it's a slightly different philosophy. One of the very truisms, I think, is you cannot inspect safety in. Okay, so what this document does, which is different to many of the other mechanisms, is it says, you are going to explain to us the risk and you are going to demonstrate the controls. It's very much differs from the checklist approach. Challenges, it's non-prescriptive and risk-based. So you are not told what to do. Many of the activities that people may want to do are at the moment not very well defined in terms of standards and guidance in the industry. And I would say that risk assessment is not terribly well understood and practiced in our environment in comparison to what's done in many other industries. I do quite a lot of training on risk assessment, and the classes are usually oversubscribed because people want to understand more about risk assessment, which I find rather strange, being as all our controls are supposedly already risk-based. Lack of knowledge in the sector as to how to implement and monitor. So many of the areas that the CWA talks about are relatively new to laboratories and scientific institutes. Many underlying standards and norms are required to implement. If you look at food safety, you look at the family of standards under ISO 22000, you have everything from auditor competence to how to do risk assessments in the form of HACCP. We don't have many of these norms in biological science. Assessment mechanisms are still largely unavailable, so who should assess and how should they assess? And lack of buy-in and uptake by industry and oversight bodies. I'm not so up to date, but my understanding at the moment is this was published in 2008. There is one institution has been certified, and that was actually in Germany several years ago. So the document is of interest, it is being used. Is there a real push for people to prioritize these approaches? I remain to be convinced. Hopefully that will happen more if it becomes an ISO standard. Very quickly, is there a risk? So this is one of the things I'm sure that you discussed yesterday, because all these controls are only really necessary if there is a risk from this type of research. So just to look at two of the parameters, first of all is likelihood. International accidents and releases are both credible scenarios, so there is a potential that something could go wrong in this particular sector. There have been significant laboratory accidents. For example, SARS. If you look at a lot of the causal factors from SARS and learn from them, there were many basic mistakes which should not have happened. They could still happen again, but I don't think necessarily drawing parallels between some of the levels of control that were in places like Singapore and China and applying it to some of these situations is necessarily always appropriate. Major accidents have occurred in other industries, Bhopal, Piper Alpha. I added Ebola in healthcare. So we know that we can have major incidents and accidents. One of the problems here is that we have to balance the need for controls with the potential impact, which for some of these agents could be enormous. Biological agents are reported to be of interest to subversive groups. I assume that is correct. That is a security threat, which I think has to be taken seriously and has to be addressed. But at the same time, much of the information people need, not just for these agents, but for other agents, is already available. And the methodologies to do sinister work are becoming easier for people as time goes on. Consequences, potentially catastrophic pathogen release. You can put all of the major accidents that have happened in the history of mankind, and you would very quickly overcome these, even with a naturally occurring organism if it's released. So one of the things that's peculiar to our sector is that if there is a problem, it could be a huge problem, not just with gain of function, some of the eradicated pathogens, some of the old pathogens that are being recreated, or simply something which has been in storage and all of a sudden makes its way back into society, as we saw recently with the incident in the US with smallpox being stored in a storeroom. So it's not all gain of function. There are many issues in this sector. Technologies could be transferred. One of the big risks I see is that society becomes very resistant to this type of work. It's not my job to say the work should go ahead. I believe that the people who conduct the work and who oversee the work have the best of intentions, and this work is necessary. If we stop doing the work, we also introduce a major problem. So my view is we should assess the work, we should decide can it be handled, can it be done safely and securely, and then we should bend over backwards to make sure that is the case, because this work brings great benefits to society. And all of these different accidents and things that I talk about can happen accidentally, but they can also happen by deliberate acts. And security, historically, has been very much a small brother of safety. Okay? And I think too much security is a problem, but I think our field has focused for many years on safety, and perhaps also we now need to look, especially for this type of work, more at security. Controls, we could stop the work. We have no risk, we can stop the work. That isn't necessarily the solution, because people can still do things. It may prevent the essential research, and the work could continue in other countries. So I have given presentations in other countries where they have spoken about these experiments and they have said, oh, this is terrible. And I have said to them, could this happen in your country? Yes. Would you even know if it happened in your country? No. Okay, so there are still many loopholes that would need to be closed. This is an international body of work. It's an international community. And if we want to really control it, we have international obligations. Potential solutions, I don't have too many, but I have suggested 4 possible areas where we might want to focus. One is to review the threats and benefits from such work. That's not really my field, but if you tell me you want it to be safe, I can help you understand what that means and make sure it happens. If you tell me you want it to be super safe, we can also do that. So there are terms like ALARP, which is as low as reasonably practicable, or ALAP, which is as low as practicable. They mean different things, but it really depends on where you want to set the height of the bar. Revision of existing standards and norms to align with 21st century biological science. We have far too much guidance, and we don't have enough standardization. Someone told me 2 days ago that there's a discussion whether the CWA should become a standard or whether it should become a guidance document. If it becomes a guidance document, I'm afraid from my perspective, that would be a tragedy. It should become a standard, and if people decide to adopt it, that is their option. But if it became a guidance document, I think it would be very sad. Reevaluate the BSL models. It's oversimplified, often not applied in the way that it should be, especially for these high resilience projects and high resilience organizations. Creation of the required approval and verification mechanisms to ensure confidence. So this is a double-edged sword. It's not only society saying we want to monitor, we want to have an overview of this particular work, but it's also to give society the confidence that we should continue with what is often essential work. Who should do it? National authorities. There are issues. WHO is not really an organization which is geared up to perform this function. BWC, anyone who has been associated knows the political issues, the difficulties there are in even suggesting words like verification. Personally, I believe this could be done more on a voluntary basis, setting up agencies and organizations who could provide that level of expertise and oversight. And lastly, improve societal measures designed to prevent the release and prepare for the realities of a biological incident from wherever it comes. If you look at healthcare and the level of preparedness in healthcare or in civil society for biological incidents, whether it's gain of function, whether it's reintroduction of an eradicated pathogen, I have to say I don't have a very warm feeling. So to take some of the methods, some of the philosophies we have in containment, we've now spread them into healthcare. I would love to see them being spread into other areas of society in terms of response should we have an incident. Conclusions: traditional means of addressing biosafety and biosecurity are under scrutiny and may not be adequate models for major hazard activities. I would also always say major hazard. A BSL-4 laboratory for me should not be high risk, it should be major hazard. If it's high risk, then we have got it seriously wrong. So we can manage major hazards. Our job is to make sure those major hazards do not become high risks. Alternatives are emerging, such as the CWA. My view is that these are really well suited to this type of activity, and I hope there is more discussion as to how they could and should be used. But the necessary drivers for their adoption remain unclear. And that includes who will provide oversight, how will they provide oversight. I often work in areas where we do things like ISO certification, and I look at the mechanisms that are required for training auditors, for conducting audits, for having audits, etc., for something as simple as certifying a hairdresser. And then I look at the inspection mechanisms that we have in this field, and they are nothing like on the same level. So not just the standards, but how do we want to control oversight? And there are existing models which could help us to do this. If we fail to address these issues, not only may we have a release, I hope that I never see the day when we have a major release from a laboratory, but I think we could have a confidence issue, not just with society, but with the funding agencies, who become more and more reluctant to provide funds for essential work, and regulators who become more and more risk-averse in terms of whether or not they should approve the work if it is funded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hartwig, for this interesting overview. This doesn't work? Yes, it does. So there is room for some questions, and we will have a discussion at the end of this session with all the speakers. So question, please. Yes, please.
I wasn't sure, I didn't understand what you meant by it would be a pity if your document would be a guidance as compared to a standard. Could you explain this a little bit more, please?
So basically a standard sets out requirements. Yeah, so a standard says this is what you shall do, and it may say it at a very high level. So it may say you will do a risk assessment on all security activities, but it actually sets out something which must be followed. Standards tend to be translated into various types of assessment mechanism which allows reasonable assessment to be made against the standards. As soon as you call something a guidance, it becomes a lower level of document. So one of the issues that we've had with the CWA is that many people have said this is a European thing and it's not a proper standard, so it isn't taken seriously. So it's partly the terminology, it's partly the way the thing is written, it's partly the way that it can be associated with formal assessment mechanisms, but a big part of it also is the degree of seriousness that it is likely to be taken by the community.
One more question? Yes, please, Mr. Feinberg.
The description of the biorisk elements was impressive in its flexibility and the range of issues to be considered. At the same time, that flexibility, it would seem, comes at a price of simplicity and clarity in order to put into place the biorisk model. Mm-hmm. How many laboratories around the world are presently prepared to move forward in the larger biorisk model as contrasted with the familiar, more simplified biohazard model?
My own humble opinion, very few. So one of the things that we did in the early days when the CWA was published is we went to one of the big vaccine manufacturing companies, and we said to them that, you know, this is available. They have procedures for procedures. I mean, they are very, very systematic. They said it would take them roughly 1 year to become compliant. So, you know, even an organization which is at that level, and laboratories by and large are very safe places. You know, we have very few serious accidents with laboratories. They've been using different models for years, and the philosophy of a quality management system is quite new to laboratories. So one of the things that always amazes me is there are fantastic quality schemes. You know, 17025, and then you say, what's the scheme for safety? And you don't see the same. You don't see the same mechanisms, even something as simple as document control. If you say to them, show me your diagnostics, show me your result, and you'll see chapter and verse, training plans, etc. You say, show me the same things for safety, or even better, show me the same things for security, and you will not get the same response. And that's part of the problem. And my own opinion is the place to start is with these major hazard facilities, and embed some of these things in these facilities, and then gradually filter it down to maybe some of the more mundane work.